if you care about press freedom, you need to care about what's happening to Glenn Greenwald in Brazil. And this is not a matter of partisan alliances. This is not a matter of who your favorite is politically or what party you belong to. Glenn, in my view, is an outstanding journalist who is unafraid to tell the truth. More to the point, he is being persecuted for his reporting, and that is a clear-cut issue of press freedom in my book. Now, Glenn is, of course, the founder of The Intercept, and here to join me now to talk about the Glenn Greenwald case, but also whatever comes up in the political situation, is Washington bureau chief for The Intercept, a good friend of the program, Ryan Grimm. Ryan is also a contributor to The Young Turks and the author of the book We've Got People, and he joins us now. So first of all, Ryan, thanks for coming back on the program, and Gesundheit.
Thank you. It's good to be back here.
Good to have you back. So Glenn Greenwald, I'm worried about him. I thought just countries like the United States and Great Britain put people in jail for honest reporting. It turns out Brazil does the same, and I'm deeply, deeply concerned for Glenn. Can you just tell us briefly what the situation is there?
Yeah, I mean, reporters, like you said, there are under threat all over the world. So Glenn has been living in Brazil for the last 15 years. He has a family there. It's his home. Several years ago, we launched a Brazilian version of The Intercept, which publishes in Portuguese, which Glenn reports for regularly. He reports for them actually more nowadays than he reports for the U.S. version of The Intercept. And in the course of that reporting, he and his colleagues at Intercept Brazil obtained a huge tranche of documents that showed that a high-profile corruption investigation that had won global praise was actually itself corrupted in many ways, and in particular that the judge Sergio Moro, who was at the head of this investigation and oversaw the trials of a lot of the figures caught up in it, including Lula, was himself regularly corresponding with prosecutors and coordinating with prosecutors and kind of guiding their case, and which is obviously a violation of any kind of common understanding of fairness, but is also in particular a violation of Brazilian law. Now, the project did succeed in putting Lula in prison, which cleared the way for Jair Bolsonaro to win the presidential election. After he won the presidential election, he made Moro not just his attorney general, but something that's called basically a super attorney general. He is an attorney general in Brazil that is bestowed with more powers than any previous attorney general has ever had. And so when The Intercept Brazil exposed the corruption behind the corruption investigators and the corruption judge, it caused complete rethinking of the entire politics of the moment in Brazil. And Bolsonaro has spent the months since then, personally targeting Glenn Greenwald and trying to kind of divert attention away from the corruption that was exposed by The Intercept and onto the reporting. And so recently, his prosecutor, a right-wing prosecutor there, unveiled a criminal complaint charging that Glenn was somehow guilty of hacking, conspired with hackers in order to obtain this information, which is, a ludicrous charge, but one that's very serious and that's, being taken very seriously by us.
So, obviously, my number one concern is besides press freedom, is Glenn's well-being and safety, and that of his family. Must be a terrifying time for them. I'm also concerned that as many people as possible understand what it means to have press freedom, what it means to fight for press freedom, and the various ways of persuasion and other tools people have to erode our press freedoms. And one of the reasons I wanted to speak with you is, for example, there's been a little bit of commentary that, well, Glenn, he picks on Democrats, and so we don't really like him. And, my feeling is if your go-to response to any journalist being targeted is, I don't like who he investigates, you ought to reconsider that. But I also, I deliberately invoked the United Kingdom and the United States because one of your other people at the Intercept, James Risen, was a subject of an investigation when he worked for the New York Times when Barack Obama was president. Glenn, of course, was instrumental in distributing the Edward Snowden data, some of which Democrats as well as Republicans looked at through a sectarian lens. I was disappointed by that. You have the case of Julian Assange looming over all of this. And I guess my concern, it goes back to Glenn's safety because we need to build support for Glenn. But broadly, I'm not sure that enough Democrats and liberals understand what press freedom is all about. I think we can say, conservatives may be more authoritarian, less likely to support it. But I really want to make sure that, quote unquote, my side, whatever you consider that to be, broadly speaking, understands that, journalists disclose confidential information. That's what they do.
Right.
And it's what we do. And because I've done it too. And once you start saying, well, I don't know, but this is information that was belonging to someone who's a member of a party to which I also belong, you've already lost the principle of press freedom. Yeah. And I'd just like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you don't have press freedom, all the other freedoms are gonna fade away. This on the hierarchy of important freedoms. The freedom to publish information that the authorities don't want published is central to any remotely decent society. Any other value that you care about will be eroded over time if you don't have a free press. Some of the founders, I think it was Jefferson, is famous for saying, if I could have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I'd take newspapers without the government. The newspapers without a government is much more likely to keep people in check than all of our democratic processes combined. And so, and it's also important to understand what that means in practice. And that means that as a society, we protect the right of journalists to publish information that the government does not want published. If you start to allow the government to constrict what can be published by a news outlet, there no longer is a free press. And so in the complaint filed against Glenn Greenwald, the main charge against him, or the main evidence used against him, they say that he advised the sources of the information that they should destroy the information on their end. Once they had provided it to the Intercept, that they were better off if they got rid of it to help protect their identities. I don't know if that's true or not. That's utterly beside the point, because even if it were true, that is just basic journalism 101. Source. Pick up the LA Times, New York Times, New York Times, Washington Post. Pick any of them up today, and on the front page, you'll see anonymous sources revealing information. Now, a lot of the times, these anonymous sources have motivations and maybe shouldn't be given anonymity all the time by journalists. But providing anonymity to sources is central to the idea of a free press, because that's what the press is here for. We're the ones that get the information out. It's not on these people to put their names to it necessarily. And so source protection is key to press freedom. And both in this case and in the Julian Assange case, prosecutors are using efforts that journalists allegedly took to protect sources as evidence that they are conspiring with those sources to commit crimes. And if we accept that chain of reasoning, then journalism is a crime.
And I think that's critically important and very well said. And again, we're talking with Ryan Grimm, Washington Bureau Chief of The Intercept, about Glenn Greenwald and press freedom. I was struck, I may be off base, but I was struck, Ryan, by the charges against Glenn Greenwald, the way they seem to look as if, frankly, they could have been written by the U.S. Government. I mean, I'm not saying they were. I don't want to.
Right.
Yeah, but I'm not saying they're not. I mean, I was struck by the fact that, first of all, I think that Trump and Bolsonaro have a affinity to one another. It wouldn't surprise me if there was some sort of, heads up given to the U.S. State Department that, hey, listen, you're this American citizen. But whatever it is, I think that, it seems to me there's a global crackdown on press freedom at this point that's gone well beyond, the old cliched view of it as something that's only endangered in third world countries or whatever. And I'm deeply concerned about it. I also wanted to talk to you about where this fits in terms of the context of what we're hearing now about, we're hearing this particularly in liberal circles again, and academics and other people who study internet communications and all that. I'm hearing an increasing amount of chatter, for lack of a better word, that basically says, the logic goes like this. We've been told by the intelligence agencies that Russia leaked certain information in 2016, the Podesta emails, the DNC, all that stuff, to make sure that Russia doesn't interfere in this election or future elections. The press needs to censor itself by saying if it receives information that serves Russian interests, and there's a possibility that was leaked by Russian sources, they must, as a matter of patriotic duty, suppress it. And I get really, really nervous when people, liberal or otherwise, tell the journalistic community, we're going to blame you for publishing confidential information if we decide, or the national security establishment decides it came from the wrong source. So, because then the only safe thing to do is publish nothing that comes where the provenance might be uncertain. And I'd just be very interested in getting your thoughts on that.
I think you're right to pinpoint that. The government's job, if this is the job that the government wants to take upon itself, is to protect its information. If it has information that it believes is sensitive, and doesn't want out there, then protect it. Don't click on Russian spear phishing links. Don't give Russians your password through some amateur hack. The job of journalists is to publish true and newsworthy information, and so we are often dealing with the most cretinous of sources. If we could only publish information that came from Boy Scouts, we wouldn't be able to publish most of the things that we end up publishing. I understand the impulse behind what they're saying, but it's not well thought through, and the implications are what you said, that the safest thing then would be to just publish nothing.
And again, we're talking with Ryan Grimm, Washington Bureau Chief of The Intercept, about Glenn Greenwald and press freedom. And it brings up another question that's come up, which is in the context of the DNC leaks. And I've actually posed this, obviously through social media, but I haven't written about it. I haven't done an article on it, but I posed this question to, Paul Begala and other people who are high up in the Democratic Party establishment and people in the journalistic world, which is, in your view, with the understanding we have now, do you believe the press should have suppressed the DNC materials, the email materials? I've never gotten an answer from anyone one way or the other. I mean, yes is one answer people might give. No is an answer other people might give. But where are you on that question? Because I tend to think a journalist gets information, a journalist's go-to response should be to publish it, particularly if it's germane to
Yeah.
people's understanding of the democratic process.
No, I completely agree with you. If the information is in the public interest, then the public has a right to know, rather than journalists deciding that they're going to suppress it because of some concern about the who is trying to benefit from it. That's not for reporters. Reporters aren't supposed to shade their reporting to try to obtain a certain benefit. They're looking for the best story that they can write that informs the public most thoroughly. And we're supposed to distance ourselves from the results of that. That you can't start guessing, what the consequences of some reporting that you do are, or else you're not doing journalism anymore. At that point, you're doing PR.
Yeah, I think that's well said, and I also think it tells me that across the political spectrum, we need to do more education of the public on the function of the press and the role of the press in a free society. Just to close the loop before we go on to other topics, just to close the loop, Brian Grimm, on Glenn Greenwald, what happens next? Charges have been filed against him, as I understand it, along the lines of what you've described. We've seen, you wrote that some lawmakers have spoken up on his behalf, Bernie Sanders, Ro Khanna, perhaps some others by now. But what happens next? Is Glenn waiting to be arrested? I don't know the process. Are there things people can do to support him?
So if you go to The Intercept, we have a petition up, and the bigger show of force that we can demonstrate, the better. Currently, there is a Supreme Court order that says that Glenn cannot be arrested, and so the prosecutor is trying to kind of pierce the protection of that ruling. So now the decision is now before a judge whether or not the prosecutor has made that case that he should be able to pierce that. If he does, the Supreme Court in Brazil has signaled that they would find that move unconstitutional, but it is not clear, what decision this particular judge is going to make, and it's not definite that the Supreme Court would make that. So the short answer is that there are still some decision makers standing in between this criminal complaint and Glenn being taken into custody, and so those arguments are being hashed out in Brazil now.
Well, I don't really know Glenn. I think we were on a panel or two once a long time ago, but please give him our best if you talk to him. And
I will do that.
And let's talk about the press in the United States, if you don't mind. There's been a lot of coverage.
Lock them up.
What's that?
You lock them up.
Well, yeah, exactly. Maybe that both sides of the aisle will be chanting that this time around.
Yes.
Let's talk about the coverage of the Democratic primary, because there have been a number of stories there. I almost can't keep up with them. One is CNN's coverage of the Elizabeth Warren claim that Bernie said a woman can't win, and their handling of it in the debate, which was kind of shocking. The other is, Joe Biden and Bernie and Social Security and what's been going on there. You pointed out that Joe Biden has been advocating for Social Security cuts for 40 years, going back to 4040, just in case people didn't hear, going back as early as 1984 and as recently as 2018. But the story now, Biden's current platform calls for limited increases to Social Security, not cuts. But my take on it is that Biden has yet to offer a narrative of why he thought one thing for 38 years and now thinks another thing. And I mean, legitimate, people could change their mind. But I think Biden is saying He never changed his mind. He was always this way. And but the story that's getting a lot of coverage is somehow Bernie's misrepresenting uh, Biden's record, and it hinges on a video that the Sanders campaign distributed. So, what's your take on all of that?
Well, Biden did spend 40 years of his career, generally advocating for a position of austerity. It was common, as you remember, among Democrats in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, and into the 2010s, to support reducing the deficit by cutting entitlements and cutting government spending and cutting defense spending. Like that was a fairly mainstream Democratic opinion, and Biden was to the right of it. Biden wanted to make sure that his political brand was that he was tough on the deficit, not a tax and spend liberal. He was always concerned about the more rural areas of southern Delaware that have more conservative politics, and so he consistently pushed for various cuts to Medicare, to Medicare, yes, but also to Social Security. He was in the original small group of senators who agreed on the compromise that led to raising the retirement age in the 1980s, and he's been, and he was calling for freezes and other cuts to Social Security, for the next several decades. And as vice president, he was involved. They're trying to frame it as, even PolitiFact look at this, is trying to frame it as views he held decades ago. But even during the Obama administration, he was advocating for cuts to Social Security. And you might even remember a short-lived the Biden committee, which met. First there was Simpson Bowles,
Right.
which was staffed by Bruce Reed, close ally of Joe Biden. When that fell through and didn't get the super majority that it needed for its recommendations of raising the retirement age, cutting Social Security, Bruce Reed went to be Joe Biden's chief of staff, and then Joe Biden led the Biden committee, which was covered heavily in a Bob Woodward book back at the time called Price of Politics. And it was Joe Biden and Eric Cantor and Chris Van Hollen and John Kyle, and they'd sit around and they came up with $4 trillion in cuts, including cuts to Social Security. And Republicans could never agree to raising taxes. And so that became the super committee, which was the next thing
Right.
later in 2011, where again, the administration put forward Social Security cuts. And interestingly, this is around the time that Occupy Wall Street starts to dominate the news with the frame of the 1% and against the 99%. And I believe that Occupy changing the terms of the conversation is what crushed the super committee. They were unable to come to a final deal under too much pressure, not just from the right to not raise any taxes, but from a rising left that was no longer interested in austerity. That if Biden were a better politician, that kind of would have been the end of his involvement in austerity politics. But the Obama-Biden administration returned to that in 2013, hoping that once again they could finally catch their grand bargain. It never happened.
And just to jump in, Ryan Grimm, 2013, if I recall correctly, was when Obama's budget proposed budget, unilaterally included the chain CPI, which is a benefit cut to Social Security. Was that the year?
The first time he did that was 2011. Is that what you said?
I thought it was the 2013 budget, which would have. Is that?
Yeah, well, he was certainly proposing it in 11 and 12, but you're right that because all of his grand bargain commissions had collapsed by then, that yes, he probably. That makes sense that 2013 would have been the first year that he just unilaterally put it in the budget, not asking for anything in return. Now, it didn't happen, but it did. It did, as Dave Dayen has pointed out, hurt a lot of other programs because the idea of chain CPI, which is basically a different and lower inflation metric, ended up going from the fringes of right-wing economics into mainstream conversation, and now is used for to measure inflation for most programs, which reduces benefits across the board consistently. So it wasn't until 2016 that Obama finally came out for raising benefits rather than cutting them, and since then the movement has been pretty steadily in a progressive direction. But you had that video of Biden in 2018 talking about Paul Ryan cutting Social Security and Medicare, and saying that Ryan is right, that we have to deal with Social Security and it needs adjustments, and by adjustments he means cuts.
So I want to talk about that in a second. And Ryan Grimm, I just did a quick check, and it was 2013 that Obama put it in the budget. He had been talking about it beforehand.
That makes sense.
2016, Obama backs off, which I also recall quite well. Two thoughts about the coverage of that 2018 video. And then I want to ask you, number one, you have 38 whatever years, decades of Biden expressing one opinion. Seems to me the bulk of the coverage in the last week or two, since this has become an issue, has been about what exactly was said on that one video in 2018. Very little about the other decades of experience, which is odd to me, number one, as that old adage that the press may not always tell you what to think, but they can tell you what to think about. We're thinking about that video when we're not thinking about the other 35 years, which is interesting, one. And number two, as for that video, the PolitiFact and the other fact checkers, the consensus seems to be Bernie misrepresented. Biden says he was being sarcastic. He didn't mean it. That therefore it's been deceptively edited or whatever. We're not talking deep fake, but something they're claiming. So the story is not, why are people skeptical about Biden's shift, but rather somehow Bernie's honesty. And so I want to get to that by asking, what's your read? Was there dishonesty there in the way it was presented? Is there credibility in Biden's claim that he was only being sarcastic when he said Ryan was right? Then we get into the whole question of what adjustments mean. I know later on he said, well, the program needs some adjustments, but did he mean cuts? Did he not mean cuts? What's your take on all of that?
I mean, I'm apparently in the minority here in seeing that this is pretty clear that he was saying that Paul Ryan was right to go after Social Security and Medicare. He clearly was attacking Paul Ryan for how Ryan went about the tax cuts. But this idea that he was being sarcastic, it just doesn't scan for me. He whispered, he said, you have to go after Social Security and Medicare. That's where the money is. And he was whispering. And when he's whispering like that, what he's doing is he's signaling that he's saying something he's not supposed to. Mm-hmm. He knows that the right politics for a good liberal are to say that we're never going to cut Social Security and Medicare. And so he drops to a whisper, he's kind of a stage whisper to let everybody in the audience know that they're in on some some iconoclastic politics right here. They're watching somebody who's really speaking courageously against what the people want. And so later in that same moment, he says, now, we need a better tax code. We need a tax code where, workers are treated well and Social Security and Medicare can stay. There have to be adjustments, but they can stay. When you're talking about adjustments to Social Security so that it can stay, you're talking about a mix of tax increases and benefit cuts. The Biden campaign has since tried to say that by adjustments they meant increases. That doesn't make any sense in the context of it can stay. It can stay, but it'll be increased. That doesn't fit the logic of the argument that he was making. And right after he says that, he says, I don't know about you, but I don't know anybody who relies, anybody in the top 1/10 of 1% who relies on their Social Security check. And what he's clearly saying there is that we should be means testing Social Security. And if you're poor enough, then of course the government is going to take pity on you. But if not, then Social Social Security for you isn't the best use of government resources, which takes it out of the universalist situation that makes it so popular, and it takes it out of the situation where people support it so rabidly because they feel like they earned it. A lot of people didn't pay in the amount that they're going to be paid back by Social Security, but they have seen Social Security being taken out of their paychecks since they were 18 years old or whatever. So they feel an ownership over it. Social Security is one of the few programs that has never been attacked successfully in racialized terms. And I think that one reason for that is that people understand that it is a universal benefit that benefits people across the board. It benefits Black and brown people more because they have less to begin with. But in general, it benefits everyone and isn't treated as a racialized program, and as a result is incredibly popular.
Well, that interpretation, first of all, the video makes a lot of sense to me, and of the politics. And the other thing I was thinking as you were going over the history, Ryan Grimm, was that when you talk, one of the things that the Simpson-Bowles Commission, Super Committee, Biden Committee, the whole shtick, because they do have shtick, these people who want to cut Social Security, and one of them is, we're being brave truth tellers here, when in fact what they're doing is shaking the money tree for big donations, which is not such a courageous thing to do. But is that Biden has made a campaign theme that, once Trump is gone, the Republicans will be sane again and will work with him, and he knows how to work with them. Well, if you put that together with his history on Social Security, one interpretation could be, I will work with Republicans again on a grand bargain that would cut Social Security. So I think, once again, the story is Biden's record on this topic. The challenge should not be to Bernie or any other candidate, but to Biden himself, to say, no, this is why I won't do that. This is why I've genuinely come to a new understanding of how budgets work, or whatever he wants to say. But he's going to have to match his rhetoric to his platform, or his platform, to me, looks like a promise he doesn't have any intention of keeping. And so just to close the loop on journalism here, I feel that many of our colleagues in the mainstream media are missing the real story here, which is, first of all, they're misinterpreting the video. I trust you on that. But secondly, it's not about a video in 2018. It's about a candidate's long-term ideology and a party establishment's long-term ideology that is out of step with the party's rank and file and with voters overall. And so the story is, what are you going to do about it? And I guess I would say, we need better media.
I think you're right that the media has struggled with this story because there's been a consensus in the media for a long time that deficit reduction is appropriate, that Social Security does need to be cut, that it's unsustainable, and that it takes political courage to go ahead and do that. And the media has been trying to set itself up as the place that's going to kind of force politicians to drink their milk, or whatever the weird phrase is. That what did Biden say?
Eat their peas, Barack Obama said. Eat their peas.
Yeah. Eat their peas, and then Biden said that they need to come to their milk.
Oh my God!
Yes.
I hadn't heard that, and I can't unlearn it. I can't unhear it now. And by the way, I've covered Pete Peterson's fiscal summits where, Dana Bash is a host, John Harwood is a host, so yes, and Martha Raddatz, of course, in 2012, vice presidential debate, everybody knows Social Security needs to be cut. We remember that moment. Mm-hmm. So, all right, well, I guess that's as good a place to end as any. We need the Intercept, we need the 0 Hour, we need places where people can get more truth on that. And we need to stand up for Glenn Greenwald, who has been a courageous reporter for years and is in trouble and needs our help. So what again can people do? There's a petition on the Intercept?
Yeah, there's a petition. I don't know exactly where it is, but if you go to theintercept.com, you can find the petition that just says, I stand with Glenn Greenwald. If you run an organization, somebody's put, I think that the Freedom of the Press Foundation, I think, is putting together efforts to to compile a coalition of groups that are going to present the petition or present a unified front against this repressive approach toward journalism.
Well, I will sign it, that's for sure. And
Appreciate it.
Yeah, Ryan Grimm, Washington Bureau Chief for The Intercept, author of We've Got People. As always, good to talk to you. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
You got it.